Hello there. Thanks for being here. I would like to show you one of my favorite exercises for teaching somebody about watercolor and how it works and what happens is a watercolor doodle. And I'm going to do this on really nice paper that I just got in the mail. I've never used this Fabriano paper before, but it was recommended by an artist that I follow, and I'm excited to give it a try. And this is a nice way to give it a try because it's not a bunch of time spent drawing, more time spent just seeing how the pigment and the water interact with the paper. So you can do this with a ballpoint pen. You can do this with a waterproof pen. I'm going to do it with a bamboo pen and some Winsor & Newton ink. I have a set of 8 different colors, and I'm using this violet ink, which I think will be really pretty. Then the other things that you need are a brush. I'm going to use this number 2 quill mop from Da Vinci Casanio. You need some paint, some water, paper towel, and I also like to have a spritzer so that I can refresh my watercolors as they dry out a little bit. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is take my pen, dip it in. Oh, by the way, this is a watercolor block, and what that means is all of the pages are glued down, and there is a place, let's see where it is on this one. I don't see it. There's a place where you can put, oh, here it is. You can put a knife into it and separate them. It separates much easier after the paper is wet. And the purpose of having it glued down is so that the paper doesn't buckle while you're painting. So the first thing I'm going to do is open my ink, get my pen ready, but I'm also going to just loosen my arm. Just kind of roll it from the shoulder, roll it from my wrist so that I can get nice loose movements as I'm doing my doodle. I call this a watercolor doodle, if I hadn't mentioned that before. Now I'm just going to dip my ink, maybe shake it off a little bit in case there's a big drop there, not that it really matters. Get the dog hair off the paper, and then I just begin. And I can roll this pen around. Notice I'm holding it very loose up at the top, and that allows me to have less control, which is great because it makes different marks and different shapes. And there we go, there's my doodle. Now I'm gonna put this bamboo pen in water so that the ink doesn't get stuck there, and we are ready to begin. Now what we could do is, if you have waterproof ink, or any ink really, you can wait and let it dry, but I do want to show you what will happen if you don't let it dry. So I'm just watering my brush, kind of tapping it off. These quills hold a lot of water, and check out what I can do with this wet ink. I can just go ahead, and basically what we're going to do with paint is just paint all of these shapes. But for now, I'm just going to go ahead and get started on some of these thicker spots of ink that I know are still wet. And I can even kind of push that ink around. I think over here, that spot should still be wet. So let me do that one too. It doesn't take very long for this ink to dry. So I might get some purple spots as I'm going. Let's do this one. This one should still be wet. Oh yeah, there we go. And it's nice, and I just have a lot of water going. Now this is really, I can tell, really nice watercolor paper. It's 140 pound. If you're using drawing paper, which is 70 pound or 90 pound, it will say right on the cover what it is. So if you're using lighter paper, paper of less weight, you might not want to use so much water, but I can get away with that here because this paper will absorb it and let the watercolors do cool things. So now I'm going to spritz my colors, and I'm not, being very careful about the paint I already have there. It doesn't really matter for this exercise. All I'm trying to do is I want to see how my paint interacts with this paper. If I'm new to watercolor, I want to see how my paints interact with each other. So, I can just go ahead and use a lot of this stuff that's already in my palette. These are a mixture. I made this palette. I bought the palette, but the paints that are added are paints that I like. Some are Daniel Smith. Some are Martha Graham. And now I'm just going around and painting the shapes in here. Now for like that one, I want to see, okay, let's take this pink color. And again, it doesn't have to be perfect. I'm mixing it with a blue, which will make it more of a purple, but kind of a different purple. And let's go ahead and touch it to this and just see what happens, how it interacts with this ink. Not so much. Let's take this one again and see how it interacts with this. I am recording this in Colorado, where the paint will dry very fast because the air is so dry. Even though it snowed yesterday, the air is still pretty dry. So you can see that I'm getting a little interaction here. If it were darker, you'd be able to see that better. So let me do a darker one, where basically these paints are bleeding into each other. And that's just good information to have. I like this exercise for my students because it helps to see how paints interact with each other and what will happen. Like, for example, if you touch wet paint with wet paint without ruining, maybe a drawing that you've spent a lot of time setting up. Maybe I don't want to ruin my drawing just to learn how things are going to go. Let's see, let's try this green over here. Now, the other thing that I'm doing is, you might notice, I am taking some paint and then making a little puddle of paint away from that shape. Not that shape, away from, it's hard to paint and talk at the same time sometimes. I'm making a puddle of color away from, what am I trying to say? I'm not taking the paint straight from this block. I can, look how thick it is if I do that. And then it really runs into there. That's great. But most of the time what you want to do with watercolor is you want to make a little puddle of paint away from, your colors. So I'm going to spritz them again. And one thing that you can do is, sometimes I have little yogurt lids that I can use to mix paint. And so I don't want to mix yellow in this palette because it's just going to get corrupted really fast with all these other colors. Yellow is a very weak pigment in terms of its saturation compared to, like, for example, that blue. So maybe I need a different container to keep those colors more pure. And I think this green might still be a little wet, so let's go ahead and put this down here and just see what happens. Cool. They're running into each other a little bit. That's great. Now, watercolor does really awesome things. Sometimes it runs, sometimes it doesn't run. All of these features are wonderful aspects of watercolor, but it's good to know when it happens and how it's going to happen, so that as you apply it to an actual painting, you have some control over, when that's happening and when it's not happening. And that we just have to learn by, giving it a try. Some paints are more assertive or aggressive than other paints. Now, in this little spot here, I've taken it straight from my palette, and so it's not mixing very well. But I can just dip a little water in there and kind of get this a little more activated. And then you can see the green moving into the brown there. And just to make it a little more intense, I'm going to take some green straight from here And then let's see what happens if I do that. Ooh, that looks really nice. Now there will be spots in a real painting where that will be a very desirable feature. But we want to make sure that, you know, we know when that's going to happen. Basically, when you touch wet paint to wet paint, they'll often run together. But as you can see, this is Cascade Green. It's a Daniel Smith color that breaks into blue and green that I really like. But it's a very assertive color compared to this burnt sienna. And so it's pushing the burnt sienna out of the way. On the other hand, over here, we have a cadmium yellow that's pushing the Cascade Green away. So, you know, there's relative, they have relative levels of assertiveness. Okay, now it's nice to sometimes mix up some grays. So I'm making a gray here by taking some green and adding it to this pink. Those are complements on the color wheel. And so they will make a nice gray color. That's not such a nice gray color. I think I'd rather have a little more blue. There we go. It's a little too red to be a gray color. And then, you know, maybe some places I've lost my line, but that's okay. This is just an exercise just to see how the paint is going to interact with my paper and with each other. So now I'm going to take a little more blue, mix it with some water, and maybe I'm just going to drop this in and see what happens. And then we just keep going around like this. Just any colors that we feel like looking at, go ahead and put them down in your spot. Now you'll notice that with my brush, I'm going to do it left-handed here to make sure I'm not covering the video. In some places, I'm using the point. Again, keep in mind I'm doing this left-handed, which is why it's looking funny. In some places, I'm using the point where I want to be on the line. In some places, I'm pushing down on the barrel, the whole body of the brush, because I can go ahead and let all that paint out. Let me show you that again with this beautiful pink color. How about over here? So I'm taking the nice point of this quill mop, and I am going into that space. But then I am going ahead and letting it all come out. You know, then my coverage is more efficient. There. And then check this out. If I want a little looseness over here, I can rinse out my brush, tap it off, maybe even tip my paper. And let that kind of run a little bit. It's already drying, and so I have to work it a little bit to get it to run. And then with your paper towel, you can tap off your brush to dry it and use it kind of like a sponge. Now, I will say this action is harder with synthetic brushes. Natural hair brushes act very nicely as sponges, and that works really well. With synthetic brushes, you might have to use the paper towel to kind of squeeze it out. Since most of you will have synthetic brushes, let me go ahead and show you for a second with one of those. I have synthetic brushes because when I'm adding paint on top of other paint, you want to have a little bit more control over the water. When you're putting down your first layer, it's kind of fun to have no control over the water, but your second layer, you usually do want a little more control. So here's a synthetic brush. These are Princeton Snap brushes. And so let me just get into some of these smaller areas with this brush. Let's do a really dark phthalo blue, which is one of my favorite blue colors. And it's such a small space, I'm actually not pushing down on the barrel of the brush. Let's do it over here too. You know, in some of these shapes, you might want to leave white. That's just totally up to you, artist preference. And if you're doing this, you are an artist. Don't even worry. Okay, I left that one really wet and really goopy so that I can show you this little trick again. So I'm getting this brush wet, tapping it off a little bit, and then let me just come in here and kind of touch it. And look what that does. Oh, that's just beautiful. And then I can just get more water and spread it around. So with the same little spot, I have 2 different values of blue. Actually 3. And if you don't know what I mean by values, let's take some more classes together. All right, let's do a couple more. Let's do another yellow. Maybe we'll do a cool yellow this time. Last time I did a warm yellow. This time let's do a cool yellow. You'll see that those yellows are a little different. This one looks a little more orange. And when we take classes together, we'll talk, oh, gotta get the dog hair out of the brush. When we take classes together, we'll talk about cool and warm colors. But for now, let me just go ahead and put this yellow down. Yellow looks great with purple because they're complements of each other. I think we need some more yellow. Actually, let's put some yellow. Ooh, look at that. The yellow bled into the blue. That's cool too. Which of course will make green. And then maybe we'll do this small one. I could even kind of mix my yellows, my cool and my warm, and come over here and maybe do this shape. And then let's see, maybe this shape down here. Yeah, that gives us some nice accents of yellow. Now this one is really wet. You probably won't be able to tell that in the video so much, but I can see that the color's kind of pooling. So that's where it might be. I can leave it like that because I have such nice paper. It will absorb and dry, but I can also squeeze out the synthetic brush and then kind of use it as a sponge to get that yellow off. And here there's just a drop of water, so I can kind of do the same thing. I still had yellow on the brush from cleaning that one up, but yellow is such a, the saturation of yellow is so low that I'll be able to easily cover that. So that's it. Just, you know, use whatever paints you have, use whatever paper you have. Like I said, if you have lower pound paper, you just might want to kind of use a drier wash, not so much water as I did. And just see how your paints will interact with the paper that you have. I actually love to do this exercise when I get new paper or try a new brand of paper so that I kind of have this information before I go into an actual painting. And I know how things, I mean, at this point I can kind of react with what's happening, but it's also really good to know before I get started. I just did a painting the other day where I drew a whole flower thing and then the paper was just absorbing the paint. It wasn't moving at all the way, for example, I just showed you that this will do. And that was because the paper hadn't been stored properly. And so it was taking the pigment more like a marker instead of watercolor. And so I didn't like that so much. And I worked around it because I'd already done a nice drawing on it, but it was not ideal. You know, don't forget, I always forgot this when I was starting, but you can turn your page too. You can absolutely turn your page. So I'm going to put some really dark purple over here. And I am pushing down, although a synthetic brush doesn't hold much in its belly. And then let's just dip into the water and pull it down even more so that I can go ahead and fill in that space. Now maybe I kind of want this to be darker up here than down here. So I'm going to take the synthetic brush, kind of squeeze it out, and then just kind of lift some of this paint. And I might even go into my purple, mix a little bit of dark, kind of thicker, more pigment, less water purple, and drop that up at the top and see what happens. And since all of this is wet, it will just blend in really nicely. All right, now I'm gonna go back to my bigger brush and maybe do this little spot. I think we might want a little more blue, but maybe I will make a green, touch a little yellow, and make a different green. soak up some of this paint here. Now, as you can see, especially for this doodle, I'm not paying too much attention to the lines. I don't care if they overlap. In fact, it's kind of good information. Like maybe I'll go ahead and paint that. And then when that dries, I can paint another shape there and see how it glazes over the green and what it looks like. I can also, if I don't like this hard line, I can shake off my brush, kind of tap the water out and touch this edge so that I no longer have such a hard line there. And then tap this out and even pick up some of that to leave it even softer. So now with this shape, I'm already planning, you know, maybe I'll glaze a color over it and just see what happens to that green once it dries. Right now it would just run, but once it dries, then I can do this little kind of square shape in a different color and see what happens. And now look at what's happened to my little dots I have over here. I dropped them in, but because the paint was all wet, it's spread out into a nice soft blue. And then of course over here where I used ink, it's very intense on the edge, which is pretty. Yeah, so that's about it. Don't forget to leave some of it white. You can even kind of set it up aside and look at it from afar and see, you know, what it needs, where it might need more dark, where it might need more light. Light is harder to, that's why people say watercolor is hard, because you can't really go back. Once you've made something dark, it's very hard to go back to light unless you have, well, we won't even get into that. There's ways, but that's another issue. That's further along. Now this, I could tell that the paint was still wet and that I could go ahead and drop some paint into it and get a run there. So that was, and then you can see with this Cascade Green where the color is breaking up into blue and green, which I think is really pretty, and add some interest to foliage and stuff. But whatever paints you have, don't worry about buying new stuff. Just use whatever paints and brush and paper you have. I like using different papers. I like using papers that aren't as good as the papers I often use, just because it kind of challenges my watercolor skills in the sense that I'm moving more intuitively with the water instead of relying on the paper. And then you can kind of take it anywhere. So give this exercise a try, have some fun, put your earbuds in and some music, ask your family to give you a little space, maybe even set a timer for like 20 minutes and just let yourself get into it for 20 minutes and see what happens. Feel free to send me the results. Thanks. Bye-bye.